Alright, what's going on everyone? Since Wizards of the Coast refuses to acknowledge that Challenger decks ever existed, I've taken it upon myself to build budget versions of top tier competitive decks, and today we're looking at Boros Convoke. This is a Boros aggro deck that looks to flood the battlefield with a ton of tiny little token creatures and then pumps them up for really big single turn attacks. So the good thing about this deck is many of the key cards are very cheap. The token producers are largely just bulk commons, and even the payoffs and game finishers they're a little bit more expensive, but still very affordable. This deck is very easy to put together on a budget. There are some cards the deck occasionally plays that we won't be able to afford, like Virtue of Loyalty and Wedding Announcement, but the good news is these aren't heavily played. They're in like 15 to 20% of decks or something. They're not in every deck. They're not staples. And even if you wanted to play these, we have plenty of budget replacements. You could play things like 3 Blind Mice, Skrell's Hive, Sanguine Evangelist, which we will be playing by the way. All of these work fine and they're much cheaper. So let's get started with the token producers. We'll be playing 4 each of Gleeful Demolition and Resolute Reinforcements, and 2 copies of Sanguine Evangelist. The spell destroys an artifact for 1 mana, and if you destroy an artifact that you control, it makes 3 1/1 goblins. And we actually want to destroy our own artifacts, and a large portion of this deck is dedicated to ensuring we have an artifact to destroy, because these tokens become very powerful when combined with our payoffs, which we'll look at in a little bit. Resolute Reinforcements, of course, very common card, 2 mana 1/1 that makes another 1/1. And the reason this is so popular is because having 2 creatures will amplify, like Lord effects and Soldier decks, can give 2 chump blockers against Stompy decks, and having 2 creatures in this deck is very significant, as we'll see in a bit. And the Evangelist is very similar. It makes a 1/1 when it enters and when it dies, and it's also a payoff because it has Battle Cry, meaning it'll give our creatures +1/+0 when it attacks. So we can already see the synergy here, right? If we played Gleeful Demolition, get 3 1/1s, play Resolute Reinforcements, there's 5 1/1s, and now Evangelist can let us attack for 10. That's the whole idea of the deck, and these 3 cards bring our total deck price to $5.26. Next we have 4 copies of Yoshin Frontliner, Voldaren Epicure, and Charming Scoundrel. And all of these are designed to give us artifacts to sacrifice to Gleeful Demolition. The first is a creature, an artifact creature, with Unearth, which means that we can sacrifice it twice, or if it's in the graveyard, at any time we can unearth it to sacrifice to Gleeful Demolition. Technically it's not a sacrifice, it's a destroy, but you know what I mean. The Epicure makes a blood token that can be sacrificed or destroyed, and Charming Scoundrel makes a treasure. And it's important to keep in mind how valuable that treasure is. In most aggro decks, you don't make the treasure that often unless you're really mana screwed. You're usually making the rule token if you're playing it aggressively, or filtering it if you're flooded. But in this deck, the treasure is the most important aspect of this card, and we're almost always choosing to do that unless we're already sitting on a pile of blood tokens. So keep that in mind. We really want that treasure token in this deck specifically. So this artifact package brings our total deck price to $15.30. Now let's look at our payoffs. We have Emodane's Recruiter, Regal Bunnycorn, and Knight Errant of Eos. The Recruiter is basically what we're built around. It's a 3 mana 2/2 that will give creatures +1/+0 and haste when it enters, and note that that will count for itself, so it will be a 3/2 with haste when we play it. It can also make a couple of 2/2s with the spell, which we're basically never looking to do. We'll only do that if we're like on an empty board after a board sweeper and we're desperate, but we're generally just going to be playing the creature. The Bunnycorn has power and toughness equal to our creature count, which is often quite huge considering how many tokens we produce. And the Knight Errant is a critical piece of this deck. It's very important. It's a 5 mana 4/4, but it has Convoke, meaning we can tap our creatures to cast it, and when we do, we look at the top 6 cards of our deck and pick 2 creatures that cost X or less, where X is the number of creatures that were used to convoke it, and we put those into our hand. So first off, we always want to tap 3 creatures for this. That way, if we see a recruiter, we can grab it. That's like the main reason we're playing this, is to search for our best payoff. But always remember that you can tap creatures that just came into play for Convoke. So let me set up the scenario for you. Let's say you have 3 creatures in play, you have 2 untapped lands, and you have a Knight Errant and a Resolute Reinforcements in hand. The tempting thing to do is to tap your 2 lands, your 3 creatures, and cast the Knight, but the correct thing to do is to tap your 2 lands, play the soldiers, then tap those 5 creatures to play the Knight for 0 mana. The reason we want to do this is it gives us more creatures on the battlefield, so if we find a recruiter, we're attacking for a huge amount of damage the next turn. So it's always important to remember when playing the Knight that if you can make creatures, it just reduces the cost. So yeah, all of these are just about taking advantage of all of these 1/1 tokens we're making. The entire deck revolves around building an army of tokens, tapping them to cast a Knight Errant to search for a recruiter, and then sending huge amounts of power at the opponent all at once, or just making a giant bunnycorn. So this brings our total up to $28.06. And we're actually almost done with the main board. We just have 1 copy of Warden of the Inner Sky and 2 copies of Witchstalker Frenzy. The first is a cheap creature that can tap creatures and artifacts to put counters on itself. It's useful if we're locked out of attacking for some reason, and it can tap our treasure and blood tokens to boot. So that's useful. The Frenzy is a removal spell. It deals 5 damage to a creature, and it will cost 1 less for each attacking creature, which means that in this deck, it typically costs 1 mana, because we're usually attacking for a ton, and this just helps clear the way to make sure that we win when we attack. And also, it destroys Shieldred, which is very important for basically any aggro deck. And this brings our total to $29.40, which isn't terrible for the main board, I don't think. And fortunately, our mana base doesn't add too much because we're playing 4 copies of Restless, however this is pronounced, and 4 copies of Battlefield Forge. So the first enters tapped, but animates into a creature. Most decks only play 2 to 3 of these, but we're stretching it to 4 because we can't afford some of the more expensive dual lands. And the Forge is super cheap because it's been reprinted so many times. As always, I use the most recent printing for the image in these videos, but the core set printings, especially the I think the 2015 one, is under $1. So yeah, definitely grab those. Sadly, the rest of the mana base does need to be filled with basics. There are some better lands we could play, but they're expensive, of course. Definitely play these if you have them, but for our budget, we're just going to fill the mana base with basics and look to improve it later, or at least that's what we'll tell ourselves, because we never improve it later, do we? But yeah, we'll get those expensive lands, some other time. Anyway, that mana base is very cheap. It's $5.52, which isn't too bad considering we're playing 8 dual lands. And our total price comes to $34.92, which is pretty great, especially for casual kitchen table magic. If you don't need a sideboard, you can just stop here. $35, and yeah, we didn't really have to make any sacrifices to the core strategy. It's just the lands that we had to lose some consistency with. But yeah, it's not bad. So let's get to the sideboard. We'll be playing 3 Lunarch Veteran and 3 Lantern Flares. These are great for the red aggro matchup because they gain life, and red aggro players they don't like that. We're also playing 2 each of Lithomantic Barrage, Destroy Evil, and Witchstalker Frenzy. These are removal spells that are useful in specific matchups. The Barrage for control decks, Frenzy for Shieldred. Destroy Evil can blow up Shieldreds and enchantments, so it's good against the Selesnya enchantment stack, for example. These are pretty expensive though. These kind of add a lot of heft to the price, so you could probably budgetize these just by playing budget enchantment removal and stuff if you wanted to, and that's fine. We're also playing 3 copies of Thalia. She's useful because she's fairly aggressive, and she's a great tempo card against decks with board sweepers. Delaying a board wipe by 1 turn can be the difference between winning and losing, and it's also pretty devastating against a Domain Ramp, for example. That deck doesn't like having all of its stuff cost 1 more. So yeah, very useful in the sideboard against specific decks. And unfortunately, our sideboard is a little bit expensive. It's $11.62. You could definitely save some money here by replacing some of the more expensive cards with bulk, but even with the fully built out sideboard, our deck total is just $46.52, which is actually very cheap considering we made basically no budget concessions at all. I mean, again, some decks do play Wedding Announcement, which is very expensive. Some decks do play Virtue of Loyalty. And yeah, our mana base is a little weak, but overall, I would say that you're going to be able to really unleash all the power that this deck has to offer. It's just that you're occasionally going to get color screwed, but chances are if you're a budget player, you're accustomed to that. So yeah, if you want to see more budget guides like this, I have an entire playlist dedicated to these, and you can find a link to it in the description below. And in the meantime, I hope this was useful. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.